We have all seen the pictures of the Great War, the trenches carved into mud, the endless lines of soldiers marching toward the wire, the shell-shocked faces of men who have seen too much. But that is only one front. For the people of Belgium, in August of 1914, the front line was not in a distant field, it was their front door. The war came to them, a grey tide of German soldiers, and with it came a new kind of fear, not just of the shells and the bullets, but of the quiet knock in the middle of the night. It was the fear of the watcher. The informant eye, the military court that operated in a foreign language and answered to a foreign emperor. You could be a schoolteacher, a priest, a teenage girl, a railway worker, and you could be accused of the ultimate crime in an occupied land, espionage. What happens when your entire country becomes a prison, and telling the truth about the enemy becomes a death sentence? What did justice look like when it was delivered from the barrel of a German Mauser? In the late summer of 1914, the German war machine rolled into Belgium. This was not supposed to happen. Belgium was neutral, its borders guaranteed by the great powers of Europe, including Germany itself. But the German High Command had a plan, the famous Schlieffen Plan, which called for a massive flanking maneuver through Belgium to crush France in a matter of weeks. Belgian neutrality was dismissed by the German Chancellor as a mere scrap of paper. The small Belgian army fought back bravely, but they were overwhelmed. By the fall, the German army occupied most of the country. The Belgian government fled, and King Albert I commanded his remaining troops from a tiny sliver of unoccupied land in the west. For the millions of Belgians left behind, a new reality began. It was a world of military checkpoints, travel restrictions, and public notices posted in German. General Feldmarschall Colmar von der Goltz became the first military governor, soon to be replaced by General Moritz von Bissing, who would rule the occupied territory with an iron fist for most of the war. Under his command, a sophisticated apparatus of control was established. The Politische Abteilung, or political department, was its brain, a vast network of spies and informants tasked with monitoring the civilian population. Its eyes and ears on the ground were the Geheime Feldpolizei, the secret military police. They were everywhere and nowhere, plainclothes agents who could be your neighbor, the man you sell bread to, the woman who sits next to you on the tram. Their job was to stamp out any hint of resistance before it could catch fire. And the most dangerous form of resistance was not the assassin's bomb, but the whisper of information. The Allies were desperate for intelligence. They needed to know the strength of the German army, where its troops were moving, what supplies were arriving by train. And the only people who could provide this information were the Belgian civilians living under German rule. Very quickly, clandestine intelligence networks began to form, a secret army of ordinary people who chose to fight back with the only weapons they had, their eyes and ears. They were housewives, priests, doctors, engineers, and even children. They counted train cars passing through their local stations. They sketched the locations of new artillery batteries. They noted the numbers on the shoulder straps of German soldiers. This information was priceless. It was written down on tiny slips of paper, hidden in the heel of a shoe or sewn into the lining of a coat, and smuggled across the heavily guarded Dutch border. From there, it went straight to Allied intelligence. One of the most famous of these networks was known as La Dame Blanche, the White Lady. It was a sprawling organization with thousands of agents, so effective that British intelligence considered it their most vital source of information on the Western Front. But this effectiveness came at a terrible cost. The German counterintelligence services were relentless. They knew these networks existed, and they hunted them with ruthless efficiency. They censored mail, tapped telephone lines, and offered huge rewards for informants. And when they caught someone, the process was swift and brutal. The journey began with an arrest, often late at night to maximize terror and confusion. The accused was taken to a prison, most famously the Saint-Gilles prison in Brussels. There, the interrogations began. They were masters of psychological pressure. Prisoners were kept in solitary confinement for weeks. Their questions met with silence or threats. They were told their friends had already confessed, that they were alone, that the only way to save themselves was to give up names. Many broke. But many more did not. After the interrogation came the trial. It was not a trial as we would understand it. It took place before a German military tribunal, a Kriegsgericht. The proceedings were in German, a language many of the accused did not speak. The defense lawyer, if one was provided at all, was a German officer who often did little more than stand beside the accused. The evidence was presented by a military prosecutor, often based on coerced confessions or the testimony of anonymous informants. The definition of espionage was incredibly broad. It was not just passing military secrets. It was helping an Allied soldier escape, distributing underground newspapers, or even just failing to report someone you suspected of resistance. Under the German military code, the penalty for almost all of these offenses was death. The verdicts were decided by a panel of German officers. There was no jury, and no real right of appeal. A recommendation for mercy could be sent to the military governor, but it was rarely granted. The entire process, from arrest to sentencing, could take just a few weeks. Consider the case of Gabrielle Petit. Before the war, she was a 21-year-old shop assistant from Tournai, an ordinary young woman with a difficult past. When the war broke out, her patriotism was ignited. She wanted to do something. She crossed the border into the Netherlands and made contact with British intelligence. They trained her, gave her a false identity, and sent her back into occupied Belgium. For over a year, she was one of their most valuable agents. She traveled across the country, gathering information on German troop movements and railway logistics. She was daring, clever, and deeply committed. She personally delivered her reports to her handlers in the Netherlands, crossing the dangerous electrified wire fence at the border multiple times. But in February of 1916, her luck ran out. She was betrayed and arrested in Brussels. She was taken to Saint-Gilles prison and interrogated relentlessly. She refused to give up a single name. At her trial, she stood defiant. When the German military court sentenced her to death, she reportedly said, "I have just one thing to say to you. You are going to see how a Belgian woman dies." On the morning of April 1st, 1916, Gabrielle Petit was executed by a German firing squad at the National Firing Range, in the Brussels suburb of Schaerbeek. She was just 23 years old. She refused a blindfold. Her last words were, "Vive la Belgique, vive le roi," or take the architect Philippe Boeck. He was a key member of a network in Brussels that helped stranded Allied soldiers escape to the Netherlands. This was not espionage in the traditional sense. It was a humanitarian act. But to the German authorities, it was treason. Helping an enemy soldier return to his army was the same as firing a weapon at a German soldier. Boeck's network was infiltrated, and in the summer of 1915, dozens of its members were arrested. Among them was a British nurse who ran a clinic in Brussels. Her name was Edith Cavell. Cavell was 50 years old, the daughter of an English clergyman. She was a respected figure in Brussels, known for her professionalism and her compassion. When the war started, her clinic treated soldiers from both sides, Belgian, British, French, and German, without distinction. But behind the scenes, she was part of Boeck's network. She used the clinic as a safe house, sheltering fugitive Allied soldiers and helping them get false papers and guides to take them to the border. It is estimated she helped over 200 men escape. On August 5th, 1915, she was arrested by the secret police. She was interrogated for weeks, believing that the evidence against her was overwhelming and that an honest confession would lead to a lighter sentence. She admitted everything. She did not betray others, but she did not deny her own actions. Her trial, along with that of Philippe Boeck and 33 others, took place in early October 1915. The court was not interested in her humanitarian motives. They were interested only in the fact that she had aided the enemy. The prosecutor demanded the death penalty for the ringleaders, including Cavell and Boeck. The neutral diplomats in Brussels, particularly Brand Whitlock, the American minister, and the Marquis de Villalobar, the Spanish minister, were horrified. They pleaded for clemency, arguing that executing a woman, a nurse, for saving lives would be a monstrous act that would horrify the civilized world. They met with Baron von der Lancken, the head of the political department, and even tried to reach Governor von Bissing himself. They argued, they begged. They warned of the propaganda disaster it would be for Germany. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. The German military authorities were determined to make an example of her. They believed the escape networks were a serious threat, and they needed to crush them with absolute terror. On the evening of October 11th, the verdict was confirmed. Death for Edith Cavell, Philippe Boeck, and 3 others. The executions were scheduled for the very next morning. If you value documented history that uncovers these forgotten stories, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual. Using sources like the official post-war Belgian government reports compiled in works like Le Livre Rouge and the detailed diplomatic correspondence found in Brand Whitlock's Belgium, a personal narrative published in 1919. Now back to the information. Brand Whitlock and the Marquis de Villalobar made one last, desperate attempt to stop the execution. They drove to the headquarters of the political department late at night and demanded to see the German officials. They were met with polite but unyielding resistance. Baron von der Lancken told them it was out of his hands. The decision was final. A German military chaplain, Reverend H.C. Gahan, was allowed to visit Cavell in her cell in Saint-Gilles prison. He found her calm and resigned. She told him, "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness towards anyone." She wrote final letters and took communion. In the early hours of October 12th, 1915, Edith Cavell and Philippa Bock were driven from the prison to the Tir National. In the cold, gray light of dawn, they were placed before wooden posts. They both refused blindfolds. A squad of German soldiers raised their rifles. The order was given. A volley of shots rang out. They were buried immediately in unmarked graves on the site. The German authorities thought they had silenced a threat. Instead, they had created a martyr. The execution of Edith Cavell caused a wave of outrage across the Allied world. She became a symbol of German brutality and Belgian courage. Allied propaganda posters showed her as a saintly figure, a woman who sacrificed her life to save others. In Britain, her execution was credited with doubling the number of men volunteering for the army. The German command had fundamentally misjudged the situation. They saw Cavell's actions through the cold, unforgiving lens of military law. To them, she was a traitor who had helped the enemy, and the punishment was just and necessary. They failed to understand how the rest of the world would see it, the execution of a nurse for acts of mercy. But the story of Edith Cavell, as powerful as it is just one story. And the German system of military justice did not stop with her. In fact, her execution only seemed to harden their resolve. They had shown the world they would not be swayed by international opinion. The hunt for spies and resistance members intensified. The arrests continued. The trials in the military courts went on. And the firing squads at the Tir National stayed busy. Another key figure who met this fate was Louise de Bettigny's, operating under the code name Alice Dubois. She was the leader of one of the most important intelligence networks in occupied France and Belgium, working for the British. She was from a noble family and used her social connections and fluency in multiple languages to move around the occupied territories, gathering vital information. Her network, known as the Alice Network, was incredibly effective, providing the British with detailed reports on German military preparations, particularly around the city of Lille. She was arrested in October of 1915, just a few weeks after Edith Cavell's execution. The Germans knew they had captured a major prize. They subjected her to intense interrogation, offering her a pardon if she would work for them as a double agent. She refused. At her trial in March 1916, she was sentenced to death. However, perhaps fearing another international backlash so soon after the Cavell affair, her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment with hard labor by the Kaiser himself. She was sent to Siegburg prison in Germany, where the conditions were appalling. She was forced to perform grueling manual labor and was often punished for her defiance. She deliberately contracted pleurisy by standing in cold water, hoping to be exchanged as a sick prisoner. Instead, an abscess developed on her lung. By the time the German authorities operated, it was too late. Louise de Bettigny died in a Cologne hospital in September of 1918, just weeks before the end of the war. Although not executed by firing squad, she was as much a victim of the German military justice system as anyone who faced the rifles at Schaerbeek. Her death was slow and agonizing, a direct result of the brutal prison sentence handed down by the military court. The system of control was not just about arrests and executions. It was about creating an atmosphere of constant, pervasive fear. The German authorities used public notices, or affiches, to announce the executions. These posters were plastered on the walls of town halls and public buildings. They listed the names of the condemned, their occupations, and their crimes. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who defy us. For every famous case like Cavell or Petit, there were dozens of others whose names are less well known, but whose sacrifices were just as great. There was Joseph Beckelmans, a ship's captain who smuggled people and information. There was Louise Toulis, a schoolteacher who worked with Louise de Bettigny's. There was Louis Gilles, an engineer who helped run an escape line. The list goes on, men and women, young and old, from every walk of life. They were bound by a common patriotism and a refusal to accept the subjugation of their country. The German occupation authorities saw themselves as rightful administrators of a conquered territory, enforcing a legal code designed to protect their army. They documented their actions with bureaucratic precision. Every trial was recorded. Every death sentence was signed and filed. They created a vast archive of their own ruthlessness. They believed they were acting according to the laws of war. But for the Belgian people, this was not law. It was terror. It was a system where suspicion was enough to lead to arrest, where a confession under duress was enough for a conviction, and where the sentence for patriotism was a bullet in the morning mist. The first year and a half of the occupation had set a grim pattern. The intelligence networks fought on, but the cost was immense. For every piece of information that reached the Allies, a price was paid in Belgian lives. And as the war dragged on, the German system of repression only grew more efficient, more brutal, and more deadly. The list of names on the red posters grew longer. and the soil of the Tier National became ever more saturated with the blood of martyrs. The red posters were the voice of the occupation, plastered on the walls of Belgian towns and cities. They spoke in the cold and bureaucratic language of the conqueror. They announced new regulations, new restrictions, new punishments, but the most feared of all were the ones that listed the names. Name, occupation, residence, and then the final, brutal judgment, zum Tode verurteilt und hingerichtet, sentenced to death and executed. For the German authorities, these effigies were a tool of psychological warfare, a way to terrorize the population into submission. They were a stark reminder of the power of the occupying army and the ultimate price of defiance. The black or red Gothic script on the cheap paper seemed to shout its message to the quiet streets. People would gather before them, reading the names in silence, fear hanging like a cold fog. For the families of the condemned, these posters were often the first and only official confirmation of their loved one's fate. They were a public declaration of a private agony, and for the members of the resistance, they were both a warning and a roll of honor. Each name represented a comrade lost, a sacrifice made, and it strengthened their resolve to continue the fight, to ensure that these deaths would not be in vain. The machine of repression was relentless, and at its heart was the hunt for the clandestine intelligence networks that riddled occupied Belgium. Of all these networks, none was more successful or more feared by the Germans than La Dame Blanche, the White Lady. It was founded in 1916 by Walter Dewey, a brilliant young engineer from Liège. He named it after a legend that the Hohenzollerns, the ruling family of Germany, would be overthrown when a woman in white appeared. La Dame Blanche was a masterpiece of clandestine organization. Dewey used his engineer's mind to design a structure that was both efficient and secure. It was structured like a corporation, with a central command and distinct departments covering different geographical sectors. It had over 1,000 agents, men and women from all walks of life, railway workers, lock keepers, priests, and society ladies all worked together. Their primary mission was to monitor the German railway system, the iron arteries that supplied the Western Front. Day and night, agents stationed near crucial railway junctions would meticulously record every train that passed. They noted the number of cars, the type of cargo, artillery, ammunition, supplies, and the unit numbers on the soldiers' uniforms. This information was then passed up a chain of command, collated, and analyzed. The final intelligence reports were written on microfilm, hidden in objects like pens or shoe heels, and smuggled across the Dutch border by a network of couriers. The information they provided was astonishingly accurate. British Field Marshal Douglas Haig would later say that La Dame Blanche was so reliable that they could practically map the entire German order of battle from its reports. They gave the Allies advance warning of major German offensives, including the massive Spring Offensive of 1918. The value of this intelligence cannot be overstated. It saved countless Allied lives. The Germans knew about La Dame Blanche. They could see its effects in the accuracy of Allied artillery fire and the preparedness of Allied troops. They devoted enormous resources to destroying it. The secret military police, the Geheime Feldpolizei, conducted endless raids and interrogations. They planted informants and offered huge rewards for betrayal, but the network's cellular structure made it incredibly resilient. If one cell was compromised, the rest of the organization could continue to function. Walter Dewey himself had a rule that he would never meet any agent he didn't absolutely have to, a measure that saved his life on several occasions. But they were not invincible. Many agents of La Dame Blanche were caught, tortured, and executed. People like Joseph Raskin, a missionary priest who used his religious duties as a cover for his intelligence gathering. He was arrested in 1917 and executed by firing squad. Or the case of Hermann Kapiau, a young engineer who was one of Dewey's top lieutenants. He was arrested, interrogated brutally, but never gave away any vital information. He was sentenced to death, but his sentence was commuted, and he survived the war in prison, one of the few high-ranking leaders to do so. The network survived, but it paid a heavy price. Every captured agent was a potential source of information that could lead to the collapse of an entire cell. The threat of betrayal, whether for money or under duress, was constant. This systematic repression was all carried out under a veneer of legality. The German authorities were careful to justify their actions based on their interpretation of international law, specifically the Hague Conventions of 1907, which set out the rules for armies occupying enemy territory. The conventions grant an occupying power the right to maintain public order and safety. The Germans interpreted this to mean they could impose their own military law, or Kriegsrecht, which superseded all Belgian civil law. They argued that anyone who acted against the interests of the German army, even if they were a civilian, was a franc-tireur or a traitor and could be sentenced to death. The system was presided over by military judges like Judge Advocate Dr. Edward Stober, a name that became synonymous with severity for the Belgian resistance. His courtrooms were theaters of summary justice, where the presumption of guilt was the starting point. They issued hundreds of decrees covering every aspect of Belgian life. It was illegal to possess a pigeon, as they could be used to carry messages. It was illegal to publish or distribute any newspaper not approved by the German censor. It was illegal to approach the Dutch border without a special pass. And most chillingly, it was illegal to know about an act of resistance and not report it to the German authorities. This turned neighbor against neighbor and created a climate of deep suspicion. A casual remark could be overheard by an informant and lead to an arrest. The policy of collective punishment meant that a single village could be fined exorbitant amounts or have its leaders arrested for an act of sabotage that occurred nearby. The men who presided over this system were figures like Governor General von Bissing, an elderly, aristocratic Prussian who saw it as his duty to break the spirit of Belgian resistance. He believed that terror was a necessary tool of war. After his death in 1917, he was succeeded by Ludwig von Falkenhausen, who continued his predecessor's ruthless policies right up until the end of the war. These men were not monsters in their own eyes. They were military officers carrying out their duties as they saw them, enforcing the laws of war in a hostile land. But their actions created a reality of daily terror for millions of Belgians. If you believe these individual stories of courage and sacrifice deserve to be remembered, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Our research for this section draws from primary source collections at the Belgian State Archives, including prisoner letters and trial records, as well as post-war exhumation reports detailed in academic journals like the Revue Belge d'Histoire Contemporaine. Now, let's return to the final days of those condemned. For those arrested and sentenced to death, the final stop was a cell in Saint-Gilles prison or a similar facility. Their letters and diaries from this time provide a heart-wrenching glimpse into their final days. They wrote of their love for their families and their country. They expressed their faith and their lack of bitterness. They tried to comfort their loved ones, to tell them they were not afraid. One condemned man, a young engineer named Paul van den Bosch, wrote to his parents, "I die for my country. I do not regret what I have done. If it were to be done again, I would do it." These letters were often smuggled out by sympathetic guards or passed to the chaplains who ministered to the condemned. Inside the prison walls, a grim camaraderie developed. Prisoners communicated by tapping codes on the walls, sharing scraps of news from the outside world. Small acts of defiance, like singing patriotic songs, could lead to severe punishment, but were done nonetheless. Food was scarce and of poor quality, and disease was rampant. The loneliness of the cell was often broken only by the sounds of other prisoners being interrogated or the distant sound of a firing squad in the yard. The execution itself was a cold, methodical procedure. It almost always took place at dawn. The prisoners would be woken in their cells, informed that their plea for mercy had been rejected, and that the sentence would be carried out immediately. They were given time to write one last letter and to meet with a chaplain. Then they were led out into the prison yard and put into a vehicle for the short drive to the execution site. In Brussels, this was the Tir National in Schaerbeek. Elsewhere in the country, there were similar sites, often against the wall of a fortress or in a remote quarry. The Tir National itself had been a simple shooting range for the Civic Guard, a place for weekend sport and recreation. The war transformed this mundane place into an altar of national sacrifice. A German officer would read the sentence. A firing squad, usually made up of 12 older soldiers from the Landsturm, would be waiting. The prisoner was tied to a post. They were offered a blindfold, but many, like Gabriel Petit, famously refused it, choosing to look their executioners in the eye. The commanding officer would give the order. A single volley would ring out, a medical officer would then check for signs of life, and a soldier would administer a coup de grace, a final shot to the head if necessary. The bodies were not returned to the families. The Germans feared that the funerals would become patriotic demonstrations, and the graves would become shrines. So they buried the executed in unmarked mass graves near the execution site, their locations kept secret. As the war entered its final year, 1918, the German position became more and more desperate. The Allied blockade was causing severe shortages at home, and the arrival of American troops on the Western Front had tipped the military balance. The German High Command launched a series of massive offensives in the springs, hoping for a decisive breakthrough before it was too late. In this climate of desperation, the repression in occupied Belgium grew even harsher. The military courts worked faster, and the number of executions increased. They were trying to secure the rear, to crush any internal threat as they threw everything they had into the final battles. But their time was running out. In the autumn of 1918, the Allied armies launched the 100 Days Offensive. The German lines broke. The German army began a long, bitter retreat back across Belgium. The occupation was over. As the German troops pulled out, a wave of joy and relief swept the country. But for the families of the disappeared, a new and agonizing task began: the search for their loved ones. After the armistice, the new Belgian government began a systematic investigation. The records of the German military courts were seized, and they provided a grim accounting of the trials and death sentences. The most important task was to find the graves. At the Tier National in Schaerbeek, investigators began to dig. They soon found what they were looking for: a series of mass graves containing the bodies of dozens of executed men and women. The site was a scene of horror and sacredness. The bodies were carefully exhumed. The process of identification began. It was a grim task. Families were called in to identify clothing or personal effects. Dental records were used. In the end, most of the bodies were identified. The same process was repeated at other execution sites across the country. The discovery of these graves caused a new wave of national mourning and anger. The Belgian government organized solemn state funerals for these newly discovered martyrs. The funeral of Gabrielle Petit in May 1919 was a massive national event. Her coffin paraded through the streets of Brussels, which were lined with vast, silent crowds. The site of the graves at the Tier National was transformed into a national shrine, the Enclos des Fusillés, the enclosure of the executed. It remains a powerful memorial to this day. In the end, it is estimated that around 360 Belgian civilians were formally tried and executed by German firing squads for espionage or related resistance activities during the 4 years of occupation. Thousands more were sentenced to hard labor in German prisons, where many died from disease, malnutrition, and abuse. And many others were executed without any trial at all, shot as hostages, or during punitive actions against civilian populations. The post-war period brought calls for justice. The Treaty of Versailles included provisions for the trial of German war criminals. A series of trials, known as the Leipzig War Crimes Trials, were held in Germany. However, they were widely seen as a farce. Only a handful of German officials were ever brought to trial, and the sentences were laughably light. Men like General Karl von Fassbender, who was on the Allied list for war crimes in Belgium, never faced real accountability. Most of the men who had run the system of repression in Belgium, the governors, the judges, the police chiefs, escaped any real punishment. But the story does not quite end there. The Germans created the red posters to inspire fear. They listed the names of the dead to show the consequences of resistance. But after the war, these same posters were collected and preserved by Belgian families and archives. They were transformed from instruments of terror into sacred relics. They became the first draft of a national martyrology, the definitive proof of a loved one's sacrifice for their country. The very tool the Germans had used to erase these people from the community became the thing that cemented their memory forever. The occupation ended. The posters came down, but the bullet holes remained.